Hey guys, tonight we're slipping softly into the velvet-draped world of Tudor England. The air smells faintly of beeswax and damp rushes. You're padding down a long corridor in lambskin slippers, the kind that make no sound against the wooden floors. Torches flicker low along the walls, throwing tall, twitching shadows of men in puffed sleeves and pearl-trimmed bonnets. Your breath echoes just a little too loudly, and you pause, listening for the silence to reassert itself. A distant lute strums somewhere deeper in the palace, but otherwise, nothing. And then it hits you. You're not just walking through a castle, you're navigating a soundscape so delicate that a sneeze could turn heads. You probably wouldn't last a day here. One misplaced whistle, one innocent hum while waiting on the Queen's procession, and you might find yourself swiftly relocated to somewhere less gilded. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that sad background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your night wandering the galleries of Whitehall, the King's London Palace, before it burned down centuries later. It's the early 1500s, and you're just another member of the royal household, well-dressed, underpaid, and perpetually aware of the social landmines all around you. The courtiers drift past like ghosts in brocade, each murmuring just enough to be polite. To speak too loudly is a faux pas. To hum, frowned upon. To whistle, risky business. The strange thing is, no one tells you this outright. It's not in the rule books or the sermons, but it's in the sideways glances, the way a man pauses at the threshold of a gallery to listen before entering, or the way a noblewoman might clear her throat delicately if your boots squeak too sharply on the waxed oak. Tudor courts ran on a different kind of noise, not volume, but rank. Sound was a sign of privilege. Heralds trumpeted for kings. Choirs sang for queens. You, however, are not a herald or a choir boy. You're a whisper in a silk doublet meant to move like a breeze between columns, heard only when spoken to. That's because in this world, noise has meaning. Loudness is power, but only if it's sanctioned. Everyone else, better off silent. The average Tudor palace was surprisingly quiet given the population. Part of that was architecture, thick stone walls, heavy doors, and closed courtyards that swallowed sound like a sponge. Part of it was paranoia. This was a time when a slip of the tongue or an accidental whistle could spark rumors of treason. After all, Henry VIII's mood was as unpredictable as a goose in a thunderstorm. One day you're in favor, the next your absence at dinner is permanent. Some whispering is welcome. Servants mutter behind sleeves. Courtiers conspire in cloisters. But a whistle is sharp. It cuts. It carries. And in a world where sound equals attention, you don't want the wrong kind. Historians still argue whether there was ever an official ban on whistling at court. No proclamations have survived to confirm it. But behavioral records suggest something deeper, a cultural shunning. Whistling like chewing with your mouth open, or heaven forbid, burping in front of the Lord Chamberlain, simply wasn't done. It didn't help that whistling was at the time associated with lower classes, shepherds on hillsides, sailors in taverns. To whistle in a palace was to remind people that you hadn't always been here, that maybe you still heard sheep bells in your dreams. So instead, you walk in silence. Your shoes are padded. Your breath is held. You nod instead of speak. You learn to communicate in eyebrow lifts and fan flicks, a language of the silent elite. Eventually, silence becomes soothing. You begin to enjoy it. The echo of your steps, the soft rustle of ruffs and satin, the sigh of a door as it closes slowly, carefully behind you. Still, you're human, and one night, perhaps while gazing at a moonlit courtyard or waiting for your turn in the privy, you let your lips part. A single low note escapes innocent, tuneless. A whistle. You feel it before you hear it. The shift. Heads tilt. A servant drops a candlestick. Somewhere a tapestry seems to breathe. And you remember velvet shoes aren't just for comfort. They're for silence. Always silence. You start your day in a feather-stuffed bed, warmer than you'd expect given the drafty stone walls. Outside the glazed window, rare and expensive, you hear nothing but the distant clatter of hooves on cobbles. Inside, all is hush. A servant has already stoked the hearth and slipped out without a word. That's how mornings go here in the Tudor court, quietly, methodically, with practiced grace. The moment your eyes flutter open, your job begins not as a laborer, but as a professional courtier, which in this age means embodying poise, fashion restraint, and silence. You slide out of bed and into linen underclothes. Then come the layers, wool stockings, embroidered doublet, maybe a velvet cloak if the weather is biting. All stitched by hand, all designed to signal your rank without you ever needing to say a word. Even your grooming routine avoids sound. Your valet pours rose water into a pewter basin. You rinse your mouth with mint infusion, careful not to gargle. your hairs combed with bone teeth, your nails scraped clean, never clipped. The clatter of scissors would be jarring, so instead, every action is softened, polished, cushioned by etiquette. Breakfast, rarely a full meal, maybe a bit of spiced wine or ale, bread with figs. You eat standing, or rather perched. A courtier doesn't slouch, and you don't speak unless addressed, especially not with your mouth full. It's considered animalistic. Whistling. Don't even joke. Still, in these quiet rituals, there's an odd comfort. The slow rhythm of morning in a Tudor palace feels almost sacred. Fire crackles. Pages turn, shoes creak faintly as servants shuffle across the gallery. And you begin to hear the deeper layers of sound. A cough. 2 rooms over, the creak of the oak beams as the castle settles. The softest possible sneeze, quickly stifled into a lace cuff. This is a world where decorum demands a kind of auditory minimalism. You learn to avoid anything sharp or sudden. Utensils are handled like relics. Chairs are drawn back with the gentlest nudge. The court trains you to be a human cat, elegant, poised, and if possible, soundless. Of course, you're not alone. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people are all waking, dressing, moving through the same space. And yet, it never feels loud. That's by design. Tudor palaces are not built for echoes. They are constructed like theaters of silence. Tapestries hang not just for warmth, but to muffle speech. Thick carpets, dull heels. Even ceilings are sometimes angled to trap noise rather than carry it. One of your fellow courtiers, a man known more for his codpiece than his intellect, once tripped over a loose tile and dropped a candlestick. The clang echoed for minutes. He spent the rest of the day apologizing with his eyes. You might think, modern as you are, that such restraint would be exhausting, but something about the hush is actually soothing. You begin to relish it. The absence of clamor becomes a kind of peace, like walking through freshly fallen snow or gliding through water. Still, there are accidents. You nearly hum to yourself while tying your cuffs. Not even a melody, just a sound rising up without invitation. You catch it in your throat like a sneeze. Around here, that's a small victory. It means you're learning. Historians still argue how much of this quiet was enforced by rule versus expected by culture. There's no surviving handbook that says, "Thou shalt not whistle." But countless letters, memoirs, and side-eyed portraits suggest a world where silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. It wasn't just about manners, either. It was about safety. Noise drew attention. And attention at court was a dangerous currency. Better to be present and forgettable than noticed and punished. Henry VIII's mood swings were legendary after all. One misplaced note, one audible breath at the wrong moment, and you might find yourself reassigned to a monastery, or worse, the Tower. In that sense, each day becomes a soft performance. You practice non-sound. You walk in rhythms that don't echo. You breathe in sync with drapes shifting in the breeze, and you begin to understand that in this strange, elegant cage of hierarchy and hushed danger, the smallest noise, a whistle, a tap, a gasp, can be the loudest offense. It happens just after the midday meal. You're standing in the presence chamber, a place not designed for comfort, but for ceremony. Sunlight filters through the leaded windows in delicate triangles, catching on golden threads in sleeves and skirts. Conversation, as usual, is sparse. A diplomat from the Spanish court clears his throat discreetly. Someone rustles a scroll. The air smells of lavender and damp wool. And then you hear it, a whistle. It's soft, almost a breath, a fragment of a tune too quick to catch, as if someone exhaled with a note by mistake. And yet it hangs there, obvious, suspicious, entirely out of place. Heads turn. Slowly, you try not to look, but everyone's eyes have the same quiet question behind them. Who was that? The thing is whistling. In Tudor times, wasn't just strange. It was seen by many as provocative. A breach in the invisible sound dam that kept courtly decorum intact. And worse, it was believed by some to carry power. Superstition ran deep in the 16th century. The belief that whistling could summon spirits wasn't confined to dusty villages or hedge witches. Even educated courtiers, dressed in velvet and lace, gave such notions private respect. A whistle in the dark might draw not only attention, but misfortune. The devil himself, they said, could write a note into your soul. And so, the court avoided it. Publicly, because it was vulgar. Privately, because it was feared. Whistling was for sailors, for street urchins, for the superstitious and unwashed. In court, it was out of tune with everything the elite wanted to appear. You shift your weight as the tension settles. No one confesses. No one needs to. The sound itself was crime enough. Someone, perhaps the poor fellow, near the tapestries, flushes pink. But the moment passes, and no one whistles again for the rest of the week. You think back to the first time you heard the rule, not written, not spoken, but implied. A senior courtier once leaned in as you passed a corridor and said, "We keep our lips sealed here, boy." You never know who's listening and who was listening. Anyone, everyone, including spies. You see, in a palace filled with ambition, silence wasn't just etiquette. It was a smokescreen. The louder the world outside, the more the court prized quiet. Every sound became suspicious. A coded message, a signal, a whistle, possibly a rendezvous, or a betrayal, or worse, a treasonous joke. Historians still argue about how far these fears went. Some claim the association between whistling and devilry was overblown, a retrospective fiction. Others insist Tudor folk genuinely believed that certain notes could invite curses or call upon unseen forces. What's certain is that nobody wanted to test the theory in front of the king. You catch your reflection in a pane of glass and notice your lips slightly parted, as if forming a tune without thinking. You close them quickly. There's a strange kind of discipline in this world, not the harsh, marching sort, but the internal kind. You train yourself not to twitch, not to tap your foot, not to hum while bored. Silence over time becomes part of your identity. Still, there's a part of you that longs to test it, to step into an empty gallery and let loose a low whistle just to hear how far it travels, to find out what the walls might say in reply. But you don't. Of course you don't. The memory of that single whistle hours earlier still clings to the air like perfume, and the courtiers keep moving smooth and silent, like shadows with gold trim. As you glide through the vaulted halls of Hampton Court, the architecture begins to speak, or rather, to muffle. You start to notice how the space itself is designed not just for beauty, but for quiet. Heavy oak doors close like cushioned books. Velvet draperies sway slightly, catching the slightest breeze, but they also absorb sound, like a thick fog rolling over hills. The whole palace is a masterpiece of near silence. And this, you realize, is by intention. It's not just that the Tudors enjoyed stillness, they engineered it. You reach the long gallery, one of those impossibly long corridors, lined with stained glass and dusty portraits. Every footstep you take seems to vanish beneath your felt-soled shoes. You hear nothing but your own breath, and the occasional creak of timbers shifting in the ceiling far above. The effect is almost eerie. But this is how courtiers liked it, because in silence, whispers carry, and in whispers, secrets thrive. The gallery was a favorite spot for conspiracies and hushed conversations, but it was also notorious for its acoustics. A murmur at one end could sometimes be heard just barely at the other. Sound traveled oddly here, in slippery threads and pockets. You never quite knew who might be listening. Hence, the caution. You pause beneath a portrait of a solemn-faced noblewoman with ringlets like coiled parchment. Her eyes seem to follow you, as if daring you to speak. You nod respectfully and move on. Hampton Court had many such spaces, echo chambers, that weren't quite echoing. Chambers designed not for shouting, but for impression. After all, sound isn't just heard, it's interpreted. And the Tudor court was all about interpretation. Your silence could mean deference or guilt. Your glance could mean admiration or treachery. And a whistle. It could be your last mistake. There's an old story about Cardinal Wolsey, who once caught a groom humming too loudly outside the chapel royal. The man wasn't punished, not exactly, but he was sent away, which in Tudor speak usually meant either reassignment to a barn in the north of England or something quieter and more permanent. No one asked questions. You don't whistle, and you don't ask. Historians still debate whether these spaces were designed for surveillance or simply the result of good masonry. Some argue that the long galleries and thick fabrics were meant to provide acoustic privacy. Others suggest it was part of a broader, courtly aesthetic, muted elegance, where even conversation became a kind of music. Whatever the reason, you learn quickly in a Tudor palace, sound behaves differently. It echoes less. It lingers more. Even the sounds you don't hear become meaningful. You notice when someone's missing from a room, when a cough doesn't come, when a lute fails to begin its usual tune in the afternoon salon. Silence becomes suspicious. There's also the phenomenon of covering noise, intentional sound used to mask action. You once watched a noblewoman drop a spoon just to cover the sound of a whispered insult. Another time, a clerk shuffled papers while slipping a letter into the sleeve of a Spanish envoy. The palace is a performance, and noise is part of the choreography. And then there's the famous Whispering Gallery, its reputation not confined to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Some claim Hampton Court had its own acoustic oddities stairwells where secrets climbed faster than feet. Rooms where your voice, barely above a murmur, could be heard across a corner without anyone seeing your lips move. You test it once. In a side chamber off the main hall, you speak your name just above a breath. A friend 20 feet away turns his head. You share a glance and immediately pretend nothing happened. You begin to imagine what a whistle might do in such a place. Not just the noise it makes, but the reaction it provokes. The way it slices through rooms that are built like velvet boxes. It's no wonder it's taboo. A whistle doesn't just sound, it accuses. It disturbs the balance. And so, as you make your way back toward the privy garden, past the stone busts and frescoes, you do so as the Tudors did, with poise and a silence so heavy it practically gleams. Later that evening, after the sun dips behind the rose-colored turrets and the great hearths begin to crackle with renewed warmth, you find yourself seated at a long table in the outer hall, neither fully public nor fully private. You're halfway through a goblet of watered wine and a plate of stewed pears when someone leans in and whispers, "Did you hear about the teacup?" You blink. The teacup. This is Tudor court code for intrigue, and you instinctively lower your voice. As it turns out, there was a scandal just last week, an incident so hushed and so curious it might never leave the palace walls. A certain gentleman, while waiting to be announced to the Queen's inner chamber, dropped his porcelain cup, but that wasn't the problem. The sound it made was. It rang out a sharp, crystalline chime that echoed through the vaulted entry like a church bell on a windy day. And it wasn't just loud. It was intentional, or so people say. Now this is where it gets interesting. According to whispered accounts, this gentleman had been under suspicion of passing messages to sympathizers of a disgraced earl. Historians still argue whether he was guilty or merely unlucky, but what most agree on is that the sound of that teacup, an out-of-place, high-pitched ring, was interpreted not as an accident, but as a signal. Because in the Tudor court, anything unusual became meaningful, and anything audible became dangerous. You shift in your seat, the wooden bench groaning faintly beneath you. Even that sound draws a glance. Someone at the far end of the table raises an eyebrow. You smile innocently and reach for your cup with exaggerated care. It's worth remembering that the Tudors lived in an age of suspicion. This was the era of coded letters of candles placed at windows as signs of fruit left to rot on purpose as warnings. A whistle, a dropped spoon, a particularly emphatic ahem, all could be read as part of a larger game of chess being played beneath the embroidery and etiquette. So the teacup, they say, might have been a message, or a mistake, or both. Either way, the man was gone the next morning. No charges, no trial, just gone. You've begun to realize the truth. At court, silence is not just the absence of sound. It's a shield, a way to stay invisible, to avoid becoming a teacup story yourself. This isn't to say there weren't rules. There were thousands spoken, Written inferred, but one of the most powerful was unwritten. Keep your sounds to yourself. If you must make a noise, let it be sanctioned. A harpsichord under direction, a bell rung at the proper hour, a voice raised only when the king himself is laughing. The man with the teacup broke that code. Whether by accident or intent, he breached the perimeter of acceptable sound. And the court, with all its grace and polish, responded the only way it knew how, with quiet removal. There's an older courtier beside you now, carving a piece of gamey fowl with surgical precision. He's been here longer than anyone else, yet speaks the least. You once asked him, why? He didn't answer. He simply placed a finger to his lips and smiled. A month later, the question feels childish. You don't ask questions out loud anymore. Instead, you become an expert in listening. You notice how each courtier's boots sound slightly different, how the queen's fool always sings a single note before entering a room, perhaps a warning, perhaps a whim. You notice how the scribes cough to signal boredom during tedious announcements. None of it is official. All of it matters. You begin to wonder if you yourself have become too loud. Have your sleeves rustled too much? Has your goblet touched the table with too much enthusiasm? Was that whisper earlier too sharp? And then you realize this is the game. A life lived by velvet echoes and glassy glances, where everyone walks the line between presence and invisibility. So you drain the rest of your wine, slowly, silently, and you make a mental note, never ever let a teacup do the talking. So was there ever an actual decree against whistling in the court of Henry VIII? A law etched into parchment and sealed with wax? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Historians still argue whether such a ban ever truly existed, or if the prohibition lived only in the tightly corseted lungs of the courtiers who feared to test it. You've searched the records, at least the ones open to common eyes, and there's nothing explicit. No edict saying, "Thou shalt not whistle near the queen's tapestry." No ordinance punishing the spontaneous chirp of the lips. But then again, that's how most of Tudor etiquette worked. Not with hammers and proclamations, but with daggers made of glances and reputations shattered in whispers. The absence of a written rule doesn't mean the boundary wasn't real. You imagine just for a moment that you're a young servant freshly brought into the court. No one tells you not to whistle, but the first time you do, maybe while sweeping the outer gallery or waiting on a lord, your supervisor, gives you a look. Not angry, not even stern, just disappointed. Then you're reassigned, maybe to the kitchens maybe further, maybe not at all. And so the message spreads not by parchment, but by silence. You teach the next person, and they the next. Generations of stiff-backed nobles and sleep-deprived servants passing down a truth too subtle for scrolls. Don't whistle here. Some scholars believe the superstition behind this taboo traces further back, possibly to medieval Christian belief that whistling indoors could invite evil spirits. Others think it stems from association with working-class sailors and shepherds whose whistling was considered low-born and disorderly. And then there's the more practical camp, who argue it simply disrupted the carefully choreographed soundscape of court life. The real answer, possibly a tangled braid of all three. You sit now in the antechamber, watching an usher polish a carved banister with rhythmic, almost hypnotic movements. Even he, in his rougher garb and low station, doesn't whistle. Instead, he hums barely. So low, you can barely tell if it's sound or just breath vibrating through his teeth. The distinction matters because humming has wiggle room. A lullaby to oneself, a subconscious tune. But a whistle, that's intentional. It projects. It says, I want to be heard. And no one at court, except those at the very top, wants that kind of attention. You think back to a conversation you overheard between two musicians, men allowed to make sound, trained to do so. One of them mentioned a rule passed around among players: never whistle a melody in the presence of royalty unless directly invited to perform. Apparently, someone once did. The queen consort mistook it for mockery. The musician was dismissed. You begin to understand that sound in Tudor England is not just decoration, it's hierarchy. There are acceptable noises, the rustle of parchment, the ring of a bell signaling mealtime, the low chorus of church song in the chapel royal. Even the occasional bark of a nobleman's hunting dog is forgiven. And then there are unacceptable noises, unregulated ones, personal ones. Whistling, as harmless as it might seem today, fell squarely in that category. In a court so obsessed with appearance and structure, the unpredictability of a whistle, its shrillness, its potential for melody, made it rebellious. It disrupted the flow. It wasn't tidy. And worse still, it had no purpose that could be traced to duty. So you hold it in. That half-tune that sometimes rises to your lips when you walk past the orchard, or stand alone in the chapel alcove, or wait in the buttery for a turn at the wine barrel. You lock it behind your teeth like a secret, and if ever you forget, even for a moment, there are always the portraits, row after row, of stern, powdered faces lining the halls staring down from their frames with an expression that seems to say, "Not in here, dear boy. Not ever." You find yourself in the great hall just before Vespers. The long tables have been cleared of their trenchers, and servants scurry like mice, sweeping away crumbs with bundles of herbs. The air smells faintly of rosemary and wood ash. A lute plucks softly in the corner. Not a concert, just an ambient hush to fill the space with something smoother than silence. And that's when it hits you. The court doesn't eliminate sound, it curates it. This is no accident. Every creak, every shuffle, every murmured aside is either intentional or swiftly disciplined. In Tudor palaces, the soundscape is as carefully orchestrated as the fashion. There's a time and place for everything. And more importantly, a volume and purpose for every tone. You remember the first time you watched a group of pages receive training not in sword play or scripture, but in how to walk. They practiced on a long plank, learning which heel placements made too much noise. Their tutor, a graying man with a voice like warm pudding, repeated the mantra, "Loud feet make dead men." You laughed quietly. He didn't. Later, you learned what he meant. During a particularly tense month, rumors of rebellion, a new alliance forming in France, a gout flare in the royal toe. One young courtier stepped too loudly near the privy chamber. That's it. Just a clatter of boots on waxed floorboards. But the chamberlain heard it, and so did a visiting ambassador. There was embarrassment, apologies, a reassignment to the borderlands. You begin to see why even minor breaches in the sound code were punished. Whistling wasn't just rude, it was unpredictable, and in a world that relied on predictability for survival, it was dangerous. Historians still debate how much of this obsession with silence was cultural and how much was tactical. Some argue it had roots in medieval monastic traditions where silence signaled piety. Others think it came from the military habits of the Plantagenets trickling down into royal etiquette. Yet another theory suggests the quiet was a byproduct of fear. Everyone worried their words or whistles would be twisted into treason. All you know is that the noise you do hear feels sacred. The slow sweep of broom brush against stone, the faint fizz of candle wax pooling around a wick, the tiny, almost imperceptible tick of the sand glass as it rotates on the chapel altar. You learn to listen to these details. They anchor you in the hush. They fill the vacuum that would otherwise tempt your lips into making a sound, maybe even a whistle. But you resist. Even the musicians are careful. Lutes are tuned backstage, not in front of the queen. Recorders are wiped with cloths so they don't squeak mid-performance. and when a harpsichord note comes out too sharp, the player dips his head as if in apology. There's a story you hear, passed from footman to kitchen maid to scullery boy, that one of Henry's favorites once got drunk and tried to start a whistling contest. The courtier was clever, funny, beloved by many. But the morning after, he was on a boat to Calais with no explanation and no farewell feast. The joke was never repeated. You try to picture what a Tudor whistling contest would even sound like. Probably awful, probably delightful, probably short-lived. Instead, what the court gets is managed melody, musicians with permits, singers trained in restraint, choirs whose harmonies rise like incense and never startle. Even laughter is moderated, polite chuckles, not belly howls. If you must lose control better, it be in tears than in volume. And so, the architecture, the people, and the customs all work together to produce a world where sound has boundaries, invisible ones, yet firm. Like velvet ropes in a gallery, you don't touch them, or in this case, you don't breathe across them. You rise from your bench in the hall and step carefully into the evening corridor. Your cloak whispers along the flagstones. Someone behind you coughs and covers it with a sneeze. You find yourself tempted to fill the silence, but you don't. You're not Nuit anymore. It's later now, and the feast is in full swing. The great hall glows with candlelight and the dull sheen of polished pewter. Meat steams on long platters. Goblets catch the flickering light, and laughter bubbles in controlled, well-bred spurts. Even revelry here is managed, calibrated, like a court musician tuning a viol. Nothing too loud, nothing too spontaneous, especially not from you. And yet, as the music swells and dancers spin in cautious arcs between the benches, a story begins to circle the room like scented smoke. The Fool Who Whistled. You've heard this tale before, passed in murmurs between servants in the buttery and embellished with each retelling. But tonight, with the room gently pulsing with music and mead, it feels closer, realer, as though the fool might tumble in at any moment, jingling and grinning. The story goes like this. During one of King Henry's more celebratory moods, perhaps after a victory in France, or a particularly satisfying roast swan, a feast was held in the orchard gallery. The Queen was radiant. Nobles were drunk, but well behaved. The fire crackled. Everything was perfect, until the fool began to whistle. Not a timid breath of sound. No, this was a full-bodied theatrical trill, bouncing off the vaults and into every ear in the chamber. The melody was jaunty, irreverent, and allegedly slightly off-key. He danced while he did it, spun in a circle, juggled figs. Some say it was part of an old Yorkshire tune meant to poke fun at the monarchy. Others claim it was improvised. Still others swear it was just nerves. A bit of air escaping the lips of a man paid to entertain, but never to improvise. The room froze. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in that subtle Tudor way. A knife paused mid-cut. A goblet hovered just above a lip. One of the musicians coughed pointedly, and then the king laughed. A full, red-cheeked roar bouncing from the stone walls and shaking the rafters. The fool was saved. For a moment. But then came the silence, the pause between the mirth and the aftermath. The moment where the fool, flushed with relief, pushed his luck. He whistled again. Higher this time. Louder. And that's when the guards were called. Historians still argue about what happened next. Some say he was dismissed from court that very night, sent off with a purse of coins and a warning never to perform within 100 miles of a Tudor palace. Others claim he disappeared entirely. His name wiped from records, his fate whispered only when the candles burned low. A few even say he was rehired at another court. Whistling, apparently, was more acceptable in Scotland. Whatever the truth, the tale serves its purpose. It's a fable now, a warning wrapped in entertainment. The fool isn't remembered for his cleverness, his juggling, or his colorful attire. He's remembered for one thing, the whistle, and you wonder, was it really so terrible? Or was it just unexpected? Did it threaten to unravel the delicate embroidery of courtly control, where everything from eye contact to laughter is scripted? You sip your watered wine and glance across the table. A younger courtier is tapping his fingers on his goblet, gently, repetitively. He catches your eye and stops, suddenly aware of the noise. You offer a small nod, an unspoken agreement. Better not. And somewhere behind you, the musicians start a new tune, one that dances just on the edge of familiarity, like a lullaby you can't quite remember. Soft, predictable, safe. That's the kind of music that survives here. As the glow of the feast fades and the torches in the outer hall burn low, you wander into one of the side chambers, half curious, half avoiding the growing press of nobility, now leaning into their final rounds of drink and innuendo. You need a little quiet, and the chamber provides it. along with a half-forgotten tale whispered by the walls themselves, whistling and witchcraft. You've heard it before, mostly from the older ladies in waiting and the apothecary's apprentice who likes to gossip more than he likes to grind herbs. But it always starts the same way. You must never whistle after dusk. That's when the veil thins. The idea isn't unique to England. In fact, stories across Europe echo with versions of this belief. In Ireland, whistling was said to summon the fair folk beings best left unbothered. In parts of Germany, a whistler at night risked calling the dead. But here in Henry's court, the whispers tied the sound to something darker: witches. The theory went like this: whistling indoors was an invitation, a signal to forces unseen, to misfortune, to malice. Courtiers whispered that a well-known lady in Anne Boleyn's circle once idly whistled in her chamber, and within a fortnight, her child fell ill. Her husband lost favor, and her hound went mad. Coincidence? Perhaps. But you've seen how quickly coincidence becomes caution in a palace like this. Historians still argue whether the Tudors genuinely believed in this kind of causal link, or if it was merely convenient, an easy scapegoat for courtly misfortune. After all, it's much easier to blame a whistle than political incompetence or a sour wine trade with the Low Countries. Still, the superstitions weren't only whispered. Some noble households hung sprigs of rosemary above doors to guard against uninvited noise. Others trained servants to pause before entering a room just long enough to make sure no whistling or humming echoed from within. And while the official clergy never outright banned such habits, they didn't deny them either. In sermons, preachers warned against idle mouths and loose lips, a phrase that, in this world, carried layers of meaning. You sit now on a stone bench beside a fire kept low to avoid smoke. The heat barely reaches your knees, and the shadows crowd in. It's quiet here, almost oppressively so. And still, you resist the urge. Just one whistle, a note, a sound. But your lips stay closed, because deep down, there's a part of you that wonders. Maybe it's just a superstition, a remnant of older times. Or maybe there was something about that frequency, something ancient, something sharp, that tore the curtain a little too wide. Maybe the whistle was a tear in the fabric of royal control, and whether it called witches or just called attention, the result was the same danger. A high-born widow you once served under used to keep a bell by her bed, not for service, but to ring if she heard a whistle in the night. You asked once why. She replied only, "Some things come for sound, not blood." And now, as the fire crackles and the court slowly drifts into a wine-soft lull. You remember her words. You remember the fool, the teacup, the endless glances traded like currency. The sound of a whistle is sharp. It cuts the air. And in this world built of velvet and suspicion, anything that cuts is unwelcome. You lean back, watching the candlelight flicker across a carved wooden ceiling. It swirls in patterns, like ivy, winding toward a center you can't quite see. And still, no one whistles. You're back in the long gallery, a space so grand it seems to stretch forever, like a corridor designed for kings to think slowly. The windows are high and narrow, filtering in moonlight now instead of sun. The torches flicker in rhythm, and footsteps are few. This is where music lives, or rather, where music belongs, because here in the court, there's a curious distinction. Musicians may, courtiers mustn't. You lean against the stone casing of a window, half watching a trio of lute players rehearse in the far alcove. Their notes float gently into the space, weaving among tapestries and carved beams like silk caught on a breeze. No one scolds them. No one shushes them, because their sound is permitted, sanctioned. They are trained, hired, and uniformed in just enough brocade to separate them from the guests they play for. You, on the other hand, couldn't play a single note without consequence, and certainly not a whistle. The difference isn't just in training, it's in purpose. Court musicians provide background, texture. They are like moving furniture, elegant, audible, and entirely safe. But a courtier who makes noise without cause is a disruption. It's not just rude, it's unauthorized expression, and that in a place as delicately poised as Henry's court is practically an offense. Historians still argue whether this division was intentional or simply evolved over time. Some suggest that musicians served as an acoustic safety valve, offering controlled release of tension, so courtiers didn't express themselves too freely. Others think it was about performance. Music was art, and art had its place. Anything outside of that, like a whistle, was not only low class, but possibly interpreted as mockery. You've heard tales of visiting ambassadors who misunderstood this rule. One such man, a Venetian, with a fondness for dramatic flourishes, once attempted to hum a tune as he waited for the royal herald to announce him. The silence that followed was thick enough to slice. The ambassador was not punished. Of course, that would be poor diplomacy. But his next invitation came very late, and his place at table much farther from the dais. Even the Queen's ladies, known for their light teasing and laughter, never whistled. At most, a soft giggle behind a fan, a drawn-out sigh, a stifled yawn. You notice now how much meaning exists in every small sound. A fabric swish can signal displeasure. A fork, placed a little too firmly, may carry insult. A throat cleared at just the right moment, as good as a dagger. But music that's different. Music is safe because it follows rules. It is measured, notated, contained within forms like pavans and galliards. It tells a story without revealing the storyteller's intent. And that's the trick, isn't it? In court, everything must be deniable. You pass the trio of musicians as they finish a song. One nods politely. You nod back, resisting the urge to compliment them aloud. It's not the time. It's not your role. Instead, you continue down the hall, your steps matching the rhythm of the last fading notes. There's a kind of envy that grows in you, not of their talent, but of their freedom. The sanctioned ability to make sound, to fill the room, to be heard. But you remind yourself that they are not free. Not really. Their noise is permitted only because it is controlled. They, too, must avoid improvisation. A missed note may pass. A whistle, never. And so you return to your silence. You carry it like a garment worn familiar, comforting. It is the sound of safety. You wonder if someday, long after your bones are dust and the halls have fallen into ruin, someone might walk these spaces and whistle freely just to see how the air responds. But not tonight. Tonight, even the music ends quietly. It's nearly midnight now, and the palace has quieted in the way great buildings do when no one dares disturb them. Even the wind seems to hush outside the stained glass windows, as if it too has learned to respect the rules of courtly sound. You're walking through the guest wing toward your chamber when you see something that makes you stop. A servant, young, nervous, barely old enough to hold a tray, steady sneezes. Just once. Just a gentle, involuntary puff of air into the crook of his elbow. And then he freezes. No one's around, not really, just you. But he still winces as though he's committed a crime. You offer a slight nod and move on. But the moment stays with you, because in this court, even sneezing feels perilously close to whistling. Both are sudden. Both draw attention. And both are things everyone does, yet no one wants to be seen doing. That's when you remember the scented handkerchief defense. It was one of the more clever, if peculiar, solutions courtiers developed to cope with the restrictions of sound. You'd seen it often, but only recently learned the logic behind it. These handkerchiefs, delicately embroidered and steeped in floral oils, lavender, rosewater, sometimes clove, served not just to smell nice or to catch the occasional tear. They were tools of auditory camouflage. You see, a sudden sneeze or cough could interrupt a conversation, offend a royal, or worse, seem like a signal. A disguised whisper. So courtiers began to time their coughs behind these handkerchiefs, hoping the rustle of linen and the whiff of perfume would mask the sound, or at least soften the blow. And whistling, well, that was even more dangerous. A whistled breath could be accidental or interpreted as subversion. Some developed tricks exhaling with a cough, pretending to clear one's throat mid-note, even coughing on purpose to conceal a near whistle. They weren't fooling anyone, but the effort was the point. Historians still puzzle over how far this practice went. Some suggest there were entire classes for noble children on how to suppress involuntary noises. Others say it was more of a whispered tradition, passed from lady's maid to chamberlain, with the quiet desperation of people trying to stay employed. You remember one particularly dramatic noblewoman, a duchess's niece, if memory serves, who carried no fewer than 5 scented handkerchiefs in her sleeves. She claimed it was for hygiene, but you suspected it was a kind of sonic armor. She was known to drop one dramatically whenever someone nearby so much as sighed with too much emotion. And then there was the tale, probably apocryphal, of a courtier who pretended to faint simply to stifle an emerging whistle. The queen, amused, ordered him a chair and a sugared plum. He never dared make another sound in her presence. You chuckle softly to yourself, but even that is carefully measured. The halls echo, after all. What's strange is how natural it's begun to feel. The silence, the control, the restraint. A week ago, you nearly hummed a tune while dressing. Now you time your breaths to match the rhythm of your footsteps. You've started folding your own linen just to reduce the rustling noise. You sip from your goblet more slowly so the wine doesn't chime against the metal rim. This isn't mere etiquette anymore. It's instinct, and so, as you reach your chamber and slip inside, you unfold your own modest handkerchief, just in case. Lavender scented, neatly hemmed, an unspoken symbol of your awareness, of your compliance, of your survival. Because in this court, to make sound is to be noticed, and to be noticed is to take a risk. And while others may tempt fate with music or power or foolish bravado, you've chosen a quieter path, one of folded linen, perfumed fabric, and breath held just long enough to stay invisible. You're seated in a window alcove the next morning, enjoying the faint warmth of a sunbeam as it threads its way through the tall panes. Your breakfast, if it can be called, That is a sliver of cold cheese and a heel of dark bread. But the real treat is the hush, that sacred, stretched out silence that comes just after the dawn bells and just before the palace stirs into ceremony. You're not alone. Far across the chamber, King Henry himself is reportedly stirring in his bed, or rather, being stirred by the groaning retinue of servants that assist him in rising. And with that shift in energy comes another. The whole building starts to inhale. And then you remember the story of the day the king tried humming. Now, mind you, it's not a tale they tell in sermons or in the official records, but it survives, whispered like a bedtime fable among chamber servants and kitchen boys. And the story goes like this. One early spring morning, before the court had fully awoken, the King Henry VIII, in one of his good humor moods, began to hum. Not loudly, just a bar or two of something vaguely familiar. A church melody, perhaps, or a marching rhythm from his youth. But the sound carried. It bounced, amplified by the vaulted ceiling of the privy chamber. It traveled down the gallery. It was heard by a page who reported it to a scribe who mentioned it to a steward, who asked a fool if it had happened. The fool, delighted by the chance to jest, whispered it to a lady-in-waiting, who passed it on to the queen's seamstress, who then, you guessed, it told everyone else. By midday, half the court was humming the same tune, quietly, carefully, and with thinly veiled amusement, until the king noticed. Now no one knows quite what he said. Some claim he laughed, others say he looked confused. One particularly dramatic account says he grew red in the face and bellowed, "Am I the only voice allowed here?" Whatever happened, the humming stopped. Instantly. And those caught still doing it, especially a bold young knight who dared to whistle the last line, were removed from the dining chamber. One never returned. Another was reassigned to guard duty in a province no one liked to name. Historians still argue whether the story has any truth. Some believe it may have originated in the reign of Henry's father, Henry VII, known for his silence and suspicion. Others claim it's a composite, a symbolic tale meant to capture the razor-edge line between familiarity and folly. But as you sit there in the sunlight, picking at your bread, the moral seems clear. Even the king, when he hums, risks misunderstanding. His sound is law until it isn't, until it's mocked, mirrored, echoed without permission. And when that happens, it becomes dangerous. Because even kings crave control over the ripple effects of their own voice. You glance at the servant sweeping the floor across the room. His strokes are long and smooth, carefully avoiding any broom bristle squeak. He doesn't whistle. Of course he doesn't. That would be madness. Not after the story everyone knows. Not after what happened to the fool, or the man with the teacup, or the humming night. In Tudor court, sound is not just heard, it's remembered, etched into rumor, carried by breath. And the wrong note at the wrong moment can echo longer than a lifetime. So when your own lips part, not for song, not for sass, but perhaps just a sigh, you stop yourself. You close them. You chew more slowly. You blend back into the hush. Because here, even the echo of the king must be handled with care. The sun is now high, casting crisp shadows beneath archways and warming the pale stone of the inner courtyards. A breeze stirs the flags above the gatehouse, and from where you sit beneath the wide overhang of the gallery, you can just make out the voices of visiting dignitaries drifting across the green. Their French is fast, almost lyrical, but even they are cautious with their tones. You're reminded of one particular guest, a French diplomat, with a fondness for whistling. He arrived, it's said, with all the pomp and sparkle of a man used to being admired. Silk shoes, powdered cuffs, a smile that was half apology, half challenge. And the moment he stepped into the outer court, he whistled. Not a melody, not a jest, just a rising note meant to call to his valet, who lagged behind with the trunks. Innocent enough, common on the continent. But here, a thunderclap would have turned fewer heads. The guard stiffened. A courtier dropped his satchel. The dog beside the master of the hunt barked once sharply. And the diplomat. He smiled, oblivious. It wasn't until he entered the antechamber and was met with the coldest kind of English courtesy, polite, distant, edged like frost, that he began to realize something was wrong. No one corrected him. Not directly. That wasn't the way here. Instead, he was made to wait. For hours. His dinner invitation was rescinded. His interpreter suddenly fell ill. His audience with the Queen was delayed until mysteriously the Queen no longer had time. The message was clear. We heard you. He did not whistle again. Historians still wonder if the response was orchestrated or merely instinctive. Some suggest the court used such moments to assert cultural superiority, demonstrating that the English were more refined, more restrained. Others think it was a genuine reaction shock at the breach of sound etiquette, so deeply embedded that even a foreigner's habits felt offensive. Either way, the Frenchman left early, and the legend grew. You've since heard the story retold with variations. Sometimes, the whistle is said to have echoed so loudly that the king himself looked up from his prayer book Other times, the valet was blamed for the sound and dismissed on the spot. But the core remains the same. Don't whistle in England's court. The diplomat, to his credit, sent a letter of apology weeks later. It arrived scented with a ribbon and written in painfully formal Latin. The court accepted it, politely, and never invited him again. What's most interesting to you is how no one ever said anything, not in writing, not in law. Yet the system responded with total clarity. One sound, just one, was enough to shift a man's standing from distinguished guest to cautionary tale. You sit quietly now, hands folded, watching a sparrow land on the far balustrade. It chirps once, twice. The sound is so natural, so sweet, that it startles you. You realize just how rare uncurated noise has become to your ears. In this world, the difference between birds and man is that the bird can sing freely. You, however, cannot. You remember a whispered remark passed to you by an older steward months ago. You're not judged by what you say, lad. You're judged by what you don't. And so you say nothing. You whistle nothing. And you survive. Evening shadows creep across the inner courtyard, now stretching long and thin beneath the archways. The golden light has turned to silver, and the great oak doors are beginning to creak closed for the night. You find yourself wandering through the privy lodgings, the more secluded, less ceremonial rooms of the palace. And it's here in the quietest wing of the court that you begin to wonder, something dangerous is there anywhere in this place where one could safely whistle? There are rumors, of course, stories passed along by those bold or bored enough to test the boundaries. And chief among them is the legend of the Privy Chamber Echo. They say there's a corner of the king's personal quarters, just near the garderobe, where the acoustics are so particular, so oddly shaped, that any sound you make is swallowed almost instantly. No echo, no carry. Like tossing a pebble into a pool that never ripples. And that's where they say the boldest of courtiers, when they're very alone, very lucky, and maybe just a little drunk, go to hum. Never more than that. Certainly not a whistle, but a hum, low and short, just to hear nothing in return. To experience the thrill of uncontrolled sound in a space designed to hold secrets. You've never dared it yourself, but tonight your feet carry you that way, down the narrow corridor, past the tapestried walls and low-burning sconces. You stop before a thick wooden door, its handle worn smooth by generations of tentative hands. And for a moment, just a moment, you think about trying it. Just a breath, a note, a test of the myth. But before you can do it, someone steps out from a side room. A royal physician, perhaps, or a keeper of the linens. He nods curtly. You nod back, and the moment is gone. You move on. Historians still argue whether this so-called echoless corner existed, or whether it was simply a metaphor invented by poets and gossips. Some claim the acoustics of the palace were studied, manipulated, even to allow certain areas to conceal sound. Others scoff, saying Tudor construction was hardly so precise. But here's what you know. The fear was real. Even the idea of a safe zone for sound tells you everything. That people needed one, that they longed for it. That in a court built on suppression, the tiniest note could feel like rebellion. It's strange to think about what noise means in a place like this. A dropped fork can make hearts stop. A cough can be read as commentary. A sneeze, as we've learned, requires a scented silk barrier and a strategically timed sigh. But a whistle is different. It's sharp, high, impossible to mistake for anything else. It cuts like a blade through still water. It doesn't ask for permission. It declares itself. And that in a world ruled by hierarchy and subtlety is what makes it so unforgivable. You round the last corner of the privy lodgings and emerge into the outer hall once more. The candles are fewer now. The laughter, too. Most of the courtiers have retired. Only the watchmen remain silent silhouettes against torch-lit stone. And you once again find yourself as part of the hush. You walk with soft steps. You breathe with care. And though the temptation still lingers in the back of your throat, caught somewhere between amusement and longing, you resist. Because even in the privy chamber, especially in the privy chamber, you know the rule. You can think about whistling. You can dream about it. But you cannot do it. The palace is asleep, or nearly so. Candles sputter behind drawn curtains, and the halls are no longer swept. Even the mice tread softly now, their paws skimming beneath tapestries and table legs with the grace of creatures who've learned the rules of the court. You too are winding down your thoughts, slower, your body tired, your mind settling like dust in a still chamber. And as you lean against the cool stone of the gallery wall, you think about what all this quiet means. How silence in the Tudor court was never just silence. It was a tool, a strategy, a symbol. It meant obedience, status, control. The quieter you were, the safer. The quieter you were, the higher you could climb. And the highest of all, the ones who never needed to speak at all. they let their presence whisper what others shouted. That's the part that takes hold of you now, as your thoughts drift into reflection. The way that silence became fashionable. There was a time when being heard was the goal, when courtiers scrambled for attention, recited poetry loudly in gardens, debated philosophy over chessboards. But as the reign grew older, more dangerous, more political, those sounds faded. Not gone, just reshaped, muted. Silence became status. You see it in the way the nobility glide across rooms without scuffing the floor. How a raised eyebrow means more than a paragraph. How a perfectly timed pause during conversation says more than an argument ever could. Historians still debate whether this was an organic cultural shift or a deliberate movement, something steered by the monarch, or perhaps by the courtiers themselves in response to the looming dread of saying the wrong thing. After all, in the Tudor court, you never needed to be guilty. You just needed to be overheard. So you begin to treasure your silence, to polish it almost. You learn to say less, to move less, to blend. And with time, you realize that quiet isn't absence, it's presence, refined. A soundless gaze, a wordless nod, a breath held just long enough to suggest knowing. And yes, it's lonely sometimes. You want to whistle, not to offend, not to signal, not to rebel, just to be human, to let a little music escape unchained by protocol or implication, to make a sound that isn't rehearsed. But you don't, because you've become part of the court now, truly. And to break the silence would be to break something sacred, something woven tighter than brocade. Instead, you close your eyes, listen to the palace breathe. It's not truly silent. It never is. There's the tick of embers collapsing into ash, the rustle of rushes underfoot, the distant clank of armor as the watch changes post, the barely audible creak of an old floorboard as someone somewhere tiptoes to their room. And in all that you realize, this is the court's true song. Not whistled, not sung, but felt. And maybe, just maybe, the absence of whistling makes every other sound more beautiful, more precious, more heard. So now, as you lie in your chamber, one candle flickering on the far wall, your body warm beneath the linen sheets, you let the stillness wrap itself around you like a well-worn cloak. The day is behind you. The sounds of the court have faded into memory. The footsteps, the firewood crackling, the clink of goblets, all replaced now with the slow rhythm of your own breath. There's something deeply calming in this hush, in this careful quiet. It's not empty. It's full of presence, of history, of lives lived carefully between words. You begin to drift. Your limbs are heavy. Your thoughts are soft. The stone walls around you seem to lean in gently like old friends guarding your rest. No one will whistle tonight. No one will speak too loudly. Not in the Tudor court. Not in the space you now know so well. And if you listen closely, if you let go just a bit more, you might hear it. The almost sound of velvet brushing against silk. The imagined echo of laughter held behind a fan. The whisper of a candle flickering out. This is where you are safe. Here in this palace of quiet power and soft rules, you are part of the hush. You don't need to speak. You don't need to whistle. Just breathe and rest and let the silence sing you to sleep.